When we say we miss someone, we often treat it as a simple emotional statement. But psychologically, missing someone is far more complex. It is not just sadness, not just longing. It is evidence of attachment. It is the mind revealing that another person has become woven into the structure of your emotional world. Human beings are not designed to exist in emotional isolation. From the very beginning of life, our survival depends on connection. As infants, we learn safety through the presence of another, a voice, a touch, a familiar face. These become signals to the brain that we are secure. Over time, those early attachment patterns evolve into the bonds we form in adulthood. When you fall in love, when you commit to someone, when you share your routines, your fears, your laughter, and your vulnerabilities, your brain does something remarkable. It begins to integrate that person into your psychological landscape. In other words, they are no longer simply someone you know. They become someone your mind expects. And this expectation is powerful. You wake up and expect their message. You experience something during the day and instinctively think, I should tell them this. You hear a song and immediately imagine their reaction. These small, almost invisible habits create a network of emotional associations in the brain. Psychologists often describe this as emotional mapping. The person you love becomes linked to daily rituals, places, memories, and even parts of your identity. So when that person is suddenly absent, whether through distance, separation, or loss, the brain experiences a disruption. The pattern has been interrupted. The system that once predicted their presence can no longer find it. And that is what missing someone truly is. It is not weakness. It is not dependency. It is the brain reacting to the absence of someone who had become psychologically significant. Think about how often we underestimate this process. People sometimes say, you should just move on, or stop thinking about them. But the mind does not operate like a switch you can turn off. When a bond forms, it creates emotional pathways that take time to reorganize. Missing someone is part of that reorganization. In fact, the feeling itself carries information. It tells you that the relationship mattered. It tells you that your emotional world expanded to include another person. This is why the experience can feel so intense. When someone meaningful leaves your immediate life, even temporarily, the brain continues to search for them. It looks for their voice in silence. It looks for their presence in familiar places. It even recreates them through memory. You may replay conversations, imagine future interactions, or revisit moments you shared. This is not accidental. It is the mind attempting to maintain connection even when physical proximity is gone. There is something profoundly human about this. We carry people within us. Long after a conversation ends, long after someone leaves the room, the emotional imprint remains. Their influence lives in the way we think, the way we interpret experiences, even the way we see ourselves. And when we miss them, what we are really feeling is the echo of that shared psychological space. But there is another dimension to this that is often overlooked. Missing someone also reveals the depth of our capacity to care. In a culture that sometimes celebrates independence above all else, we forget that emotional interdependence is not a flaw. It is a fundamental part of being human. To love someone is to allow them to matter. And when someone matters, their absence will always be felt. This does not mean you are incomplete without them. It means that for a period of time, your life was expanded by their presence. They shaped your emotional rhythms. They influenced how you moved through the world. And when they are not there, the space they occupied does not disappear immediately. It lingers. In many ways, missing someone is the mind's way of honoring that connection. It is a reminder that relationships are not transactions that begin and end neatly. They are experiences that leave traces within us. Those traces can ache sometimes. They can surprise us at unexpected moments. But they also testify to something meaningful that once existed between two people. And perhaps that is the deeper psychological truth. When you miss someone, it is not simply because they are gone. It is because at some point they became part of who you are. And once someone becomes part of your inner world, their absence will always speak. So the next time you find yourself missing someone you love, pause before you judge the feeling or try to push it away. Instead, recognize what it reveals. It reveals that your capacity to connect is alive, that your heart allowed another person to matter. And in a world where genuine connection is increasingly rare, the ability to miss someone deeply may not be a weakness at all. It may be proof that you loved with your full humanity. After understanding that missing someone reflects the emotional attachment we form, we can begin to look at another layer of the psychology behind it, our deep human relationship with familiarity. Human beings are creatures of patterns. The brain is constantly organizing the world into predictable sequences that make life feel stable and manageable. We wake up at certain times, follow certain routines, sit in the same chair, check the same messages, talk to the same people. Much of our emotional stability actually comes from these patterns. They create a sense of continuity. When someone you love enters your life, they gradually become part of that continuity. At first, the connection may feel exciting precisely because it is new, but over time, something more subtle begins to happen. The unfamiliar slowly becomes familiar. Their voice becomes recognizable even in a crowded room. Their laughter becomes something your nervous system associates with comfort. Their presence becomes something your mind anticipates. Psychologically, familiarity is deeply soothing. The brain prefers what it already knows. It interprets familiarity as safety. This is why, when you think about the person you love, the feeling is often not only passion or excitement, it is also a quiet sense of ease. You do not have to explain every thought. You do not have to perform a role. You exist together within a shared rhythm. In many relationships, this rhythm becomes almost invisible. Couples develop their own language of small gestures, a certain way of greeting each other, a glance that carries meaning, a routine phone call at the end of the day. None of these moments seem extraordinary on their own, but together they form an emotional structure. The brain absorbs these patterns in ways we rarely notice. For example, you might unconsciously expect to see their name appear on your phone at a certain time. You might associate a particular cafe with your conversations together. You might hear a song and immediately remember driving somewhere with them. These associations are not random. They are neural connections formed through repetition and emotional significance. The brain links people to experiences, environments, and routines. Over time, that person becomes woven into your daily psychological map. So when they are suddenly absent because of distance, a breakup, or simply being far away, the brain encounters something unexpected. The patterns remain, but the person is missing from them. This is where the feeling of missing someone often intensifies. You walk into a place you used to visit together, and something feels incomplete. You experience something funny, and instinctively reach for your phone to tell them, only to realize you cannot. The brain is following an old script, but the other character is no longer there, and the mind notices the gap. This disruption can feel surprisingly powerful because familiarity is not just about habit, it is about emotional orientation. Familiar people help us navigate our inner world. They provide reference points for who we are. Think about how often our identity is reflected through another person's presence. We become the one who shares certain jokes with them, the one who confides certain thoughts, the one who experiences particular moments together. In this way, familiarity does not only stabilize our routines, it stabilizes our sense of self. So when someone disappears from that familiar landscape, there is a brief moment of disorientation. The brain asks, where does this feeling go now? Who do I share this with? Where do these thoughts belong? This is why missing someone can arise in the most ordinary moments, not during dramatic emotional scenes, but while walking past a familiar street, hearing a familiar song, or sitting in a familiar silence. The absence becomes visible because the familiarity remains. Interestingly, this also explains why new relationships can feel so transformative. When we allow someone new into our life, we begin creating entirely new patterns of familiarity. New places gain meaning, new rituals develop, new emotional associations form. In other words, love reshapes the mental map through which we experience our world. But when someone leaves that map, their imprint does not disappear immediately. The mind continues to recognize the routes you once traveled together. And this recognition is what we call longing. Longing is not just a desire for the person themselves. It is a desire for the familiarity they represented, the rhythm, the predictability, the quiet understanding that came from knowing someone deeply. This is why the process of healing or adjusting after someone's absence often involves creating new routines. The brain gradually learns new patterns, it builds new associations, it discovers that familiarity can evolve. But that does not erase the significance of what once existed. It simply acknowledges that the mind is capable of expanding again. When you understand this, missing someone begins to look less like an emotional problem and more like evidence of a meaningful psychological bond. It shows that your life once reorganized itself around another human being, and that reorganization does not vanish overnight. So when you notice yourself missing someone in small, unexpected moments, try to see what your mind is really telling you. It is reminding you that familiarity is powerful, that connection shapes our daily lives more deeply than we realize. And perhaps the deeper lesson is this: the people we love do not just occupy our hearts, they quietly become part of the patterns through which we experience the world. And once someone becomes part of those patterns, their absence will always leave a space where familiarity used to live. If attachment explains why someone becomes important to us, and familiarity explains how they become part of our daily emotional structure, then memory explains why their presence can continue to feel so vivid even when they are no longer physically there. Because when we miss someone we love, we are not only responding to their absence, we are also responding to the powerful way our minds preserve the moments we shared with them. Human memory is not a neutral recording device. It does not store experiences like files in a cabinet. Memory is selective, emotional, and deeply influenced by meaning. The moments that stay with us are rarely the ordinary ones. They are the ones that carried emotional intensity, moments of laughter, vulnerability, discovery, intimacy, and relationships are full of those moments. Think about how quickly your mind can travel backward in time when you think about someone you love. A single image appears. A conversation late at night, a walk you took together, the way they looked at you during a quiet moment. These memories do not simply appear as facts, they return with sensation. You remember how it felt to be there. This is because emotional experiences are encoded differently in the brain. When a moment carries emotional significance, it activates systems responsible for both memory and feeling. The result is that these experiences become more vivid, more durable, and more easily triggered. In other words, the more emotionally meaningful a moment was, the more likely it is to stay with you. This is one reason missing someone can feel so powerful. When a person is absent, the mind often turns toward memory as a way of maintaining the connection. It replays moments not simply to remember them, but to feel them again. You might recall a conversation and suddenly smile. You might remember a small gesture and feel a wave of warmth. Or you might revisit a moment and feel the ache of realizing it cannot happen again in exactly the same way. Memory becomes a bridge between presence and absence. But there is something else important to understand here. When we remember someone we love, we are not simply replaying reality. Memory also has a creative dimension. Over time, the mind tends to highlight certain moments and soften others. It organizes experiences into emotional narratives. This is why, after a relationship ends or someone moves away, people often say, "I keep remembering the good times." The brain naturally gravitates toward memories that carried emotional reward. Laughter, closeness, tenderness, these moments stand out. This does not mean the relationship was perfect. It simply means that emotional memory prioritizes what felt meaningful. In many ways, this is the mind's attempt to preserve the value of the connection. The memories we keep are not random. They are reflections of what mattered most to us. And sometimes, those memories can feel almost alive. You hear a phrase they used to say, and suddenly you hear their voice in your mind. You return to a place you once visited together, and the entire scene reappears as if time briefly folded back on itself. These experiences remind us that relationships do not disappear entirely when circumstances change. They continue to exist within our internal world. This is part of what makes human connection so remarkable. We are capable of carrying other people with us psychologically long after the moment itself has passed. But memory also has another function. It does not only preserve the past, it helps us interpret it. When we miss someone, our memories often invite us to reflect on what that relationship meant. What did we learn? How did we grow? What did that person awaken in us? Sometimes the memory reminds us of joy. Sometimes it reminds us of vulnerability. Sometimes it reminds us of parts of ourselves that only emerged within that particular connection. In this sense, missing someone can become a form of reflection. The mind revisits those moments not only because it longs for them, but because it is trying to understand their significance. And perhaps this is where the psychological depth of longing becomes most visible. Missing someone is not only about wanting the person back, it is about acknowledging the chapter of life that unfolded with them. Every meaningful relationship creates a story within us. The memories are the pages that remain, even when the chapter ends. The question then becomes, what do we do with those pages? Some people try to close the book entirely, believing that forgetting is the only way to move forward. But the human mind does not function that way. What it remembers for a reason. The more meaningful approach is not to erase those memories, but to integrate them, to recognize that they shaped who we are becoming. When we do this, the act of missing someone changes. It becomes less about loss and more about acknowledgement. We realize that those moments were not wasted simply because they ended. They were part of the experience of loving and being loved, and that experience leaves an imprint that continues to influence how we see the world, how we connect with others, and how we understand ourselves. So when memories surface and you find yourself missing someone, pause before trying to push the feeling away. Instead, ask what that memory is reminding you about your capacity to care, to connect, to feel deeply. Because in the end, the memories that return to us are not just echoes of the past. They are evidence that at some point in your life, you were fully present in a moment that mattered. And a life filled with moments that mattered is never something to regret. It is something to honor. If attachment explains why someone becomes emotionally important to us, familiarity explains how they become woven into our daily lives, and memory explains why their presence continues to echo within us, then there is one final dimension to consider: what absence itself does to love. Because distance, surprisingly, is not only something that weakens connection. In many cases, it clarifies it. When someone is constantly present in our lives, their importance can become invisible. Not because they matter less, but because the human mind adapts quickly to what is always available. Psychologists often refer to this as emotional habituation. The things we encounter every day gradually fade into the background of our awareness. Think about how often this happens in relationships. When two people share daily life, messages, routines, conversations, responsibilities, the relationship becomes part of the normal landscape. We assume the person will be there tomorrow and the day after that. Their presence becomes something stable, almost predictable. And while stability is a beautiful part of love, it can also make appreciation quieter. Then something changes. The person travels away, the relationship pauses, the connection shifts. Suddenly, the familiar voice is no longer heard each day. The message does not arrive at the usual time. The small rituals that once structured the relationship are interrupted. And in that silence, something interesting happens. Clarity appears. The mind begins to recognize what it had previously taken for granted. Moments that once felt ordinary suddenly reveal their significance. The conversation before sleep, the shared humor, the simple comfort of knowing someone understands you. These things gain emotional visibility when they are no longer easily accessible. This is why people often say they realize how much someone means to them when they are apart. But this realization is not simply sentimental. It is psychological. Absence changes perception. When something valuable becomes temporarily unavailable, the brain reassesses its importance. What once felt routine becomes meaningful. This is part of the paradox of love. Closeness creates comfort, but distance can renew awareness. In fact, many long-term relationships experience cycles of this dynamic. Partners move between periods of intense closeness and moments of individual distance. Work schedules change, responsibilities shift, life introduces temporary separations. And within these movements, something essential can happen. Each person has the opportunity to rediscover the other, not as a permanent fixture in their life, but as a person they actively choose again. Missing someone creates space for that rediscovery. When we feel the absence of someone we love, we begin to notice the ways they enriched our emotional world. We remember the particular way they listen, the way they challenge us, the way they see parts of us that others might overlook. In this way, Absence can deepen appreciation. But there is another layer to this process that is equally important. When someone is not constantly present, we are also invited to reconnect with ourselves. The space created by distance allows reflection. It gives us room to consider who we are within the relationship and who we are outside of it. Healthy love always contains this balance, two individuals connected deeply, yet still capable of standing within their own identities. Paradoxically, missing someone can strengthen this balance. It reminds us that love is not possession. It is connection between two autonomous people who continue choosing each other over time. This perspective transforms the experience of longing. Instead of viewing it purely as pain, we can begin to see it as information. Longing reveals what we value. It reveals the emotional qualities we seek in another person. It reveals the connections that truly nourish us. And that knowledge is powerful, because when we understand what we miss about someone, we also understand what we cherish in relationships. Perhaps it is emotional safety. Perhaps it is intellectual companionship. Perhaps it is the freedom to be completely ourselves. Whatever the answer may be, the feeling of missing someone points toward the qualities that matter most to our emotional lives, and that awareness can guide our future choices. It can encourage us to protect meaningful relationships rather than neglect them. It can remind us to express appreciation while the person is still present, rather than waiting until distance forces us to notice their importance. In many ways, the psychology of missing someone ultimately leads us back to gratitude. Not a vague or sentimental gratitude, but a conscious recognition that certain people expand our lives in ways that are rare and profound. When we acknowledge this, love becomes less passive. We no longer assume that meaningful relationships will sustain themselves automatically. Instead, we become more intentional. We listen more carefully. We express appreciation more openly. We protect the connections that truly matter. Because once you understand how deeply another person can shape your emotional world, you also understand how valuable that presence is. And perhaps this is the final lesson in the psychology of missing someone. Absence does not only reveal who we love, it reveals how we want to love. So when you find yourself missing someone, let the feeling guide you toward awareness rather than regret. Let it remind you of the people who bring depth, meaning, and vitality into your life. And most importantly, do not wait for distance to tell someone they matter. Tell them while they are still close enough to hear it.